Hello and welcome to week 7, lecture 7 of Man301 Strategic Management, semester 1 2020. This week we're going to be looking at international strategy. Slides once again are an adaptation of the Hansen resources, the resources for your textbook. I encourage you to purchase your textbook. You will also have the access to the original slides if you do that, plus some other teaching resources. So, where does this fit in our model of the strategic management process? In the first part of our course, we talked about the external environment, the internal environment, and the strategic mission, which fold together to our weeks on strategic input. In the second part, strategy formulation, we've talked about business level strategy, corporate level strategy, and competitive rivalry. This week we're doing international strategy, and next week we'll talk about cooperative strategy. One of the key reasons for talking about international strategy is that in reality most businesses are in some way operating in an international environment, or alternatively they are competing with firms that are. So, once we've done the next 2 weeks, this week international strategy, next week cooperative strategy, we're going to move on to focus on the third area, strategic implementation. Now, as well as that, I want to re-emphasize that each week when we've talked about business level strategy, competitive rivalry, corporate level strategy, and now international strategy, next week cooperative, we have linked it to here, strategic competitiveness and above average returns. And indeed, when we talked about the internal organisation, how you gained value, core competencies, we also linked that to strategic competitiveness at above average returns. So that's our model that we're using. We're going to continue on that model. And this week, as I said, we're looking at international strategy. In this first section, we're going to talk about the objectives of this week. We're going to introduce a model that describes the sort of stages in international strategy, the key characteristics of international strategy. And we're also then going to talk about the incentives for entering international market. That's objective 1. Then we're going to move on to talk about our other objectives. So here we go. Objective 1, explain incentives that can influence firms to use an international strategy. Objective 2, identify 3 basic benefits firms achieve by successfully implementing an international strategy. Objective 3, describe international business level strategy. That relates back to the business level strategies that we've discussed before. And 3, international corporate level strategies, slightly different but aligned with our discussion of corporate level strategies last week. We're then going to look at environmental trends that affect international strategies, particularly focusing on those international corporate level strategies. 5 market entry modes, discuss the 2 major risks of international strategies, and then look at strategic competitiveness outcomes from international strategies, particularly in international diversification strategy. So, let's firstly, before we introduce objective 1, introduce 2 aspects of international strategy that are important. The first is the difference between domestic and global markets, and the second is our model of international strategy. Domestic markets tend to be relatively stable, tend to be relatively predictable, tend to be less complex, and the reason they're less complex is because you're only dealing with one business environment, one industry environment, one country environment, rather than multiple industry, business, and country environments. But because of globalization, the number of businesses that operate in a purely domestic market has greatly decreased. It used to be, maybe 20 years ago, that the big telecommunication companies were largely operating in the domestic market with a monopoly. 40 years ago, before the entrance into the Australian market of McDonald's and Burger King and KFC, almost 50 years ago for KFC, the corner business, the chicken shop, the charcoal chicken shop, the burger company, any fast food, the fish and chip shop operated without international competitors. They're in largely a domestic market. Flash forward to now, online global traders have affected the retail supply chain. Amazon has been able to enter the Australian market. We talked about the role that Woolworths Holdings South Africa had in operating in Australia as David Jones and as the Country Road Group, expanding out of the multiple international markets it operates in as a department store, a supermarket, and effectively a shopping centre owner with a finance arm attached in 15 countries in South Africa. So as you can see, many companies have now been able to enter the international market, and very few companies operate in a purely domestic market. Also, one thing to remember that because of the change in technology, because of the change in supply chain, because of the more efficient transportation networks, though of course we have some trouble at the moment with air travel and shipping, obviously, because of COVID-19, but because of those changes and because of the use of the internet, firms are now able to operate, even small firms can operate as part of a global supply chain or supply directly to customers, to consumers. Firms like Premier Investments, which, as we've talked about before, operates a number of retail fashion stores, used to make their money by being able to uniquely source products with few competitors and bring them over from low-cost countries with a great big markup and sell them in shopping centres. But now all of us can go and source clothes or footwear direct from suppliers, technology, almost anything, whether it's eBay, Amazon, Alibaba, as platforms to operate in, or whether people are dealing directly through their own platforms. So domestic markets have declined, which means that most firms are now operating in global markets. Global markets are unstable, global markets are unpredictable, global markets are risky and complex because you're operating in more than one environment, and they're being enabled by globalization. So traditionally, when we looked at the way firms expanded internationally, they would expand because of a set of drivers, and they'd expand gradually in a staged process. But now firms can be born international. They can start seeking opportunities that are regional or global. And there are many other ways that a firm can expand and ways that they can operate across borders. But really they are still seeking to go international because they're seeking one of four, or more than one of four, they can seek all four of these at the same time, international opportunities. Increased market size, increased return on investment, economies of scale and learning, and the advantage of location. And we're going to talk about three of those things actually being the basic benefits. Return on investment is more an outcome of a benefit rather than a basic benefit. So, but for the moment, we'll just leave that in that column. To do that, they need to exploit their resources and capabilities to create core competencies. They can exploit their resources and capabilities at international business level strategy based on their business level strategy that they're currently pursuing in the domestic market. Or they can follow one of three international corporate strategies: multi-domestic strategy, global strategy, and transnational strategy. The way they enter international market. The mode of entry is through exporting, licensing, strategic alliances, acquisitions, and establishing a new subsidiary, which is a greenfield creation of a new company overseas. They have problems and risks which impact on their ability to use their resources and capabilities through those methods to achieve strategic competitiveness. And strategic competitiveness can be measured by better performance in the way we've talked about better performance, but we've also talked about the ability to innovate because you're sourcing information, you're sourcing skills, you're sourcing knowledge, you're sourcing other people's competencies, and you're being from other markets, and you're being exposed to those other markets, which may make your firm more innovative, which will feed back into your performance. So, opportunities and outcomes from international strategy. This table identifies the key model that we're talking about. And in fact, your Moodle exercise is to identify a company that you might use as an example, and then try to identify what opportunities it's been driven by, what it's trying to achieve, what strategy it's using, what modes of entry are they using, any risks that you see from that mode or that strategy, and what strategic competitiveness they're seeking to gain from those choices. And gee, wouldn't that make a great exam question? If I asked you to explain that, wouldn't that create a great exam question? Okay, so that's our framework that we're going to discuss. And one of the reasons I put that framework at the beginning is that, in fact, if we look at the rest of the objectives for the rest of the day, the rest of the lecture, each of those objectives deals with one or other of these things on this screen here. So let's move on to objective 1. What are the incentives that can influence firms to use an international strategy, whether it's a business level strategy or a corporate level strategy? Well, there, again, with models being simplifications of reality, this objective talks about incentives. The next objective objective 2 talks about the 3 basic benefits which are there. But as you can see from the model we just explained, there was some overlap between those benefits. The reason that you want to go to a different country is to gain easier access to raw materials, to gain opportunities to integrate your operations on a global scale, to share synergies across borders, to access technology, or to better use the technology you've developed in your home market that you want to use in other markets before the intellectual property that you have is no longer protected, or before someone can copy or duplicate or find a different way to use something to create the same competitive advantage that you're creating from your intellectual property in their, or your technology in their processes, and to gain access to consumers in other markets, particularly in emerging markets. The emerging markets model in international strategy normally gets used to describe emerging economies. However, it can also be used to describe just new markets that you weren't selling in before. So when Netflix started in America, even though the next countries that it went into were Australia and the UK and Germany, I think was the third, they were all developed economies, obviously, but they were emerging markets. However, quite often you're describing it in terms of emerging economies as well. So don't get those two things confused. It can be either in the model. You notice that I didn't talk about the product life cycle. The reason I didn't talk about the product life cycle is because I want to spend an entire slide on that. And the reason I haven't yet talked about the basic benefits is that's objective 2, the next objective. So let's have a look at those things. Extending the product life cycle. This is the classic rationale I mentioned before, this sort of stage process. When a firm introduces their product to the domestic market, they've introduced the product, they've started to get market share there, may in fact have some level of dominance in that market, and as they grow in that market, they then seek other opportunities, and those other opportunities sometimes arise because there's demand to the firm for its products. Demand from grey market overseas or from formal exporters asking them to export their products or their services overseas. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know lots of people that had Netflix America well before Netflix started in Australia. And the reason they had the US version of Netflix was because apparently Netflix weren't policing their VPNs really tightly, but because it was so much, all the competitive advantages of streaming over cable TV was so evident. And if you had the ability to have an American VPN, or even if you had an American-based credit card, and you knew one zip code, which might be 90210, you were able to access American Netflix. So there was this enormous demand. And I believe, though I can't prove, because Netflix don't release these things, that that's one of the ways that Netflix used to select which markets to enter was based on the demand for its export products. But we see other things that are exported as well. The Australian wine tends to go initially where there is a demand for it from direct exporting, for example. Once you've got your product may be unique, your product may be different, other competitors in the markets that you're exporting into begin production to compete with you, or they may enter your market with their products. So you begin production abroad to compete with them. That normally happens by beginning in this staged model, by beginning your production in a similar environment, if you're from a developed country, you start producing in another developed country. And then as you get standardized processes, you relocate your product manufacturing to low-cost countries. That's the traditional stage model. Let's throw that out, though, as the only model. Because clearly firms now use global value chains to reduce their costs. They manufacture, import, assemble from different countries to enable them to achieve innovation, competitiveness, low cost, differentiation. So all this staged model, the classic rationale, has been tilted on its head in a way by the emergence of globalization. Okay, we'll take a brief break now, and once we come back, we're going to look at Objective 2, the basic benefits.